The city outside the Cross estate never really slept. Somewhere past the iron gates and the manicured hedges, trucks moved through the docks under cover of contracts that meant one thing on paper and another thing entirely in practice, and men who answered to Damien Cross made sure nothing moved without his knowledge. He had built that world brick by brick since he was 23 years old, inheriting a fraction of his father's business and turning it into something far larger, far colder, far more efficient than his father ever managed. People who worked for him respected him. People who worked against him feared him. And for 34 years, that had been enough, until the night 8 months ago when a phone call told him his wife's car had gone off the coastal road in the rain, and suddenly all the power in the world couldn't undo a single second of what had already happened. He hadn't slept in 4 days, not real sleep, the kind that lets a man forget for a few hours that his world fell apart. Damien Cross stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching the fourth nanny in 3 weeks back away from the crib with her hands raised like she was surrendering to something far more dangerous than a 6-month-old baby. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cross," she said, voice trembling. "I've tried everything. She won't stop. She won't even let me near her." Damien said nothing. He never said much these days. He simply nodded once, and the woman gathered her coat and let herself out, just like the tree before her. Behind him, his daughter's cries rattled through the marble halls of the Cross estate, bouncing off walls that had once held parties, laughter, music, before grief moved in and never left. He walked to the crib and looked down at her, this tiny, furious creature who had inherited her mother's eyes and, it seemed, her mother's refusal to be comforted by anyone but herself. He picked her up, the way the books said to, the way his security chief Marco had shown him once with visible awkwardness, and for a moment, just a moment, her cries softened into hiccups. Then she caught sight of his face and began wailing again, louder than before. "She doesn't like me," Damien muttered, more to himself than to anyone. The house was quiet except for that crying, quiet the way a house is quiet when there's too much money in it and not enough warmth. 3 floors below, in the staff wing, a young woman named Elena Mush scrubbed grout lines with a toothbrush because the housekeeper said the inspection-grade marble had to clean before the weekend gala, gala or no gala, baby crying or not. Elena had been hired 2 months earlier through an agency that placed desperate workers in desperate houses, and she'd taken the job because her younger brother needed surgery money and pride didn't pay hospital bills. She'd heard the stories about Damien Cross before she ever set foot in the mansion, that he ran half the import business on the east side of the city, legitimate on paper and untouchable everywhere else, that his wife had died in a car accident 8 months ago and he hadn't been the same since, that grown men feared his silence more than other men's shouting. She had also heard, from the cook, about the nannies. 4 of them now, each lasting less than 2 weeks, each leaving with the same hollow look on their face, like the house itself had drained something out of them. Elena didn't think much of it. It wasn't her business. She mopped floors and ironed shirts and kept her head down, because keeping her head down was how people like her survive in houses like this. That afternoon, carrying a stack of folded linens past the nursery, she heard the baby crying in a way that stopped her cold, not the ordinary cry of hunger or tiredness, but something raw, something that sounded almost like grief itself trying to escape a body too small to hold it. She paused at the open door. Inside, Damien stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid, the baby in his arms, both of them somehow more alone together than either would have been apart. She shouldn't have spoken. She knew the rules, Staff do not address the family unless addressed first. Staff do not enter rooms uninvited. Staff exists at the edges of a house like this, present but invisible. But something in her chest pulled tighter than the rule could hold, and before she could stop herself, she said softly, "May I try?" Damien turned, and for the first time, Elena saw his eyes up close, not cold the way the staff described them, but exhausted in a way that looked almost like drowning. He studied her for a long moment, this maid in a grey uniform with flower dust still on her sleeve, and something about her steadiness made him hesitate instead of dismiss her outright. "She doesn't stop for anyone," he said. "I'd still like to try, sir," Elena answered. He didn't know why he handed her the baby. Maybe exhaustion had worn down his judgment. Maybe some instinct older than reason told him this woman was different. The moment his daughter settled into Elena's arms, something shifted, not silence exactly, but a softening, the cries slowing into broken little breaths instead of full screams. Elena hummed, low and wordless, something her own mother used to hum to her before everything in her life became about survival instead of softness. The baby's small fist curled around a strand of Elena's hair and held on. Damien stood frozen, watching his daughter quiet in the arms of a stranger after weeks of refusing comfort from professionals paid triple what this woman likely earned. "How?" he said, not really a question, more a demand the universe owed him an answer to. "She's not crying because she's difficult, sir," Elena said quietly, still swaying gently. "I think she's crying because everyone who's held her has been afraid of her. Babies feel that. She needed someone who wasn't afraid." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it landed in Damien's chest like something cracking open after being sealed shut for months. He hadn't realized until that moment how afraid he himself had been, of his daughter, of his grief, of the unbearable softness loving her required when he'd spent his whole life building hardness as armor. He looked at Elena Mush, a maid he'd probably passed a dozen times without truly seeing, and felt the first unfamiliar stirring of something he refused to name. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena, sir." "Elena," he repeated, like he was testing whether the word might mean something. "Come back tomorrow. Same time." It wasn't a request, not exactly an order either, something in between, something neither of them had a name for yet. Elena nodded, handed the now-calm baby back with visible reluctance, and excused herself before her hands could betray how fast her heart was beating. That night, Damien sat in his study long after the house went dark, replaying the moment his daughter had stopped crying, the way Elena's voice had cut through chaos like it belonged there. He told himself it meant nothing, a household staff member with a knack for soothing children, useful, replaceable, nothing more. But some part of him, the part he'd buried since his wife's funeral, recognized something dangerous. He had looked at another human being and, for the first time in 8 months, felt something other than numbness. He poured himself a drink he didn't drink, just to have something to hold, and let himself think, for the first time in weeks, about Sophia. Not the funeral, not the rain-slick coastal road, not the phone call that had stopped his heart mid-sentence in a board meeting, but Sophia laughing in this same study, barefoot on the cold marble, teasing him for working too late, telling him their daughter would grow up thinking the office was his real home if he didn't learn to leave it behind sometimes. He'd promised her he would. He hadn't kept that promise even once before she died, and the guilt of that unkept promise had calcified into something harder than grief, a kind of punishment he assigned himself daily, refusing comfort because he didn't believe he deserved it, refusing his own daughter's eyes because they were Sophia's eyes, and looking at them too long felt like drowning. He hadn't expected a stranger in a grey uniform to be the one who reminded him that grief and love weren't supposed to cancel each other out forever. Elena, meanwhile, returned to the cramped staff quarters she shared with two other maids, and lay awake turning the encounter over like a stone in her palm, smoothing its edges, trying to understand why a powerful man's gratitude unsettled her more than his coldness ever had. She thought of her own mother, who had spent 20 years waiting for Frank Marsh to choose his family over the man he answered to, and who had died of a heart that simply gave out from waiting too long for a man who never arrived. Elena had sworn, standing at that funeral at 19 years old with her 12-year-old brother's hand in hers, that she would never again build her life around a man who belonged to something bigger and colder than the people who loved him. And yet here she was, 3 years later, lying awake because a man who belonged to something bigger and colder than anyone she'd ever met had looked at her like she mattered. She told herself it was nothing too, a desperate father, a lucky moment, nothing that concerned a maid who needed this job to survive, who couldn't afford to want things above her station, who had learned the hard way that hope was a luxury people like her paid for in heartbreak. Her brother Tommy was waiting on a second surgery the doctors said couldn't be delayed past the new year, and every dollar she earned in this house went straight toward that bill. She had no room in her life for anything as reckless as feeling something for Damien Cross. But the next morning, when she walked past the nursery and heard, for the first time in weeks, the baby laughing instead of crying, she felt something bloom in her chest she hadn't let herself feel in years, the dangerous, fragile thing called hope. The script continues through Damien gradually requesting Elena's help daily, staff gossip and jealousy escalating, a rival executive plotting to use the baby's vulnerability against Damien, Elena's hidden past surfacing, her father once worked for a rival family, raising suspicion among Damien's men, a tense confrontation where Damien must choose between protecting his business reputation and defending Elena, a kidnapping threat against the baby that Elena helps prevent through quick thinking, the slow burn of trust turning into genuine connection, a misunderstanding that nearly cost Elena her job and her place in the child's life, and the emotional climax where Damien, finally confronting his grief over his late wife, realizes his feelings for Elena are not a betrayal but a continuation of his capacity to love, culminating in the kiss reference in the title, delivered after Elena saves the baby during a moment of real danger, followed by Damien publicly elevating her status in the household and committing to building a future with her despite the risks to his empire and reputation. Days turned into a routine neither of them spoke about out loud. Every afternoon at 3, Elena would finish her assigned chores early, and every afternoon at 3, Damien would find a reason to be near the nursery instead of in his office buried under contracts and threats disguised as business proposals. The staff noticed first, the way staff always notice things before the people involved are ready to admit them. Whispers moved through the kitchen like smoke. "She's just a maid," one of the housekeepers said, not unkindly, but with the weight of a warning. "Men like him don't fall for women like her. They use them and move on, and the women like her are the ones left cleaning up after." Elena heard it, of course. She heard most things said about her, because people speak more freely around someone they've already decided is beneath noticing. She told herself it didn't matter what they said, that she was only doing her job, that a baby's comfort had nothing to do with the father's gratitude lingering a little too long in his eyes when she handed his daughter back to him each evening. But she found herself dressing more carefully in the mornings, smoothing her hair before her shift, and hating herself a little for it. Not everyone in the house watched Elena's rise with warmth. Priya Nandasena, the housekeeper who had run the Cross Estate staff for nearly a decade and had seen nannies, assistants, and even a long-forgotten cousin of Sophia's try and fail to find permanent footing in this house, watched Elena with narrowing suspicion. Priya had built her position on being indispensable and invisible at once, and something about a maid being summoned by name to the family wing unsettled the order she had spent years maintaining. "You think this makes you special?" Priya said one evening, cornering Elena in the linen closet under the pretense of restocking towels. "A man like that doesn't fall for the help. He's grieving. He's lonely. He'll wake up one morning and remember exactly what you are, and you'll be packing your bags with nothing to show for it but a bad reputation and a broken heart." "I'm not trying to be anything to him," Elena said, though the words felt thinner leaving her mouth than she wanted them to. "Then stop dressing like you are," Priya snapped, and left her standing alone among the folded sheets, heart pounding with a mixture of shame and quiet defiance she didn't fully understand yet. Priya wasn't malicious by nature, only protective of a fragile order she'd spent a decade building in a house that ran on careful invisibility, and she began, quietly, reporting Elena's irregular hours to the estate's business manager, not out of cruelty, she told herself, but out of duty. It was this report, sitting innocuously in a weekly staff summary, that eventually crossed Marco's desk and prompted him to dig deeper into the new maid's file, uncovering the Calloway connection that would soon threaten far more than gossip. It was Marco, Damien's head of security, who first raised the concern that would set the rest of the story into motion. He found Damien in his study one evening, reviewing shipment manifests that were really just a cover for the calls he made to men who didn't appear on any manifest at all. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "we ran the background check on the new girl. Elena Marsh. And her father, Frank Marsh. He used to run logistics for the Calloway family before they went under 5 years ago." Marco let that sit in the air the way he let most dangerous things sit, waiting to see how Damien's face would change. It didn't, not visibly, but something behind his eyes sharpened. The Calloways had been rivals once, the kind of rivalry that ended in funerals on both sides. If word got out that a Calloway-affiliated family had a daughter inside the Cross household, inside the nursery, alone with his child, it wouldn't matter that Elena herself had nothing to do with any of it. Perception was its own kind of truth in this world, and perception could get people killed. "Does she know who I am?" Damien asked. "Really know? She knows you're powerful. I don't think she knows the rest. But boss, if anyone finds out a Marsh is this close to your daughter, people are going to ask questions you don't want asked. Questions about loyalty. Questions about whether this is a coincidence." Damien sat in silence for a long time after Marco left, turning the information over, hating how much it complicated something that had started to feel, for the first time since his wife's death, almost simple. He thought about confronting Elena, demanding answers, putting distance between his daughter and a risk he couldn't fully calculate. But when he walked past the nursery that night and saw her through the cracked door, rocking his daughter to sleep, singing something soft and tuneless under her breath, he found he couldn't make himself walk in and accuse her of anything. The confrontation came anyway, 3 days later, when Elena found him waiting for her outside the nursery, his face carved from something colder than she'd seen since their first conversation. "Tell me about your father," he said, no greeting, no softness. Elena's stomach dropped. She'd known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that her family history might surface eventually in a house like this, where everyone's past got dug up and weighed against their usefulness. My father worked in logistics, she said carefully. For a company that doesn't exist anymore. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years, Mr. Cross. He made choices I didn't agree with, and I left. I needed this job because I have nothing to do with whatever he was involved in. The Callaways, Damien said, watching her face for any flicker of deception. I know the name, she admitted, voice steady despite the fear climbing her throat. I know what it meant to people like you. I also know what it cost my mother, watching my father choose those people over his own family, over and over, until there was nothing left of him to choose anything with. I didn't come here to bring trouble into your house, sir. I came here because I needed to feed my brother and pay for a surgery insurance wouldn't cover. That's the whole truth of it. Something in her voice, raw and unguarded in a way none of his enemies ever allowed themselves to be around him, convinced Damien more than any background check could have. He spent his life around people who lied smoothly, who trained their faces to hide everything. Elena's fear looked nothing like that. It looked like a person telling the truth and terrified it wouldn't be believed anyway. I believe you, he said finally, and watched the tension drain out of her shoulders. But you should know, if anyone outside this house learns about your father's history, it won't matter what the truth is. People will assume the worst. They'll assume I'm careless, or that you're a plant, or both. I need you to understand the danger you're in just by being here. Just by being near her. He nodded toward the nursery. I understand, Elena said quietly. Do you want me to leave? The question hung between them longer than either expected. Leaving would be safer, for her, for his daughter, for the fragile peace the household had found in the last few weeks. But Damien thought of his daughter's laughter that morning, the first real laughter since her mother died, and thought of how much of that laughter belonged to the woman standing in front of him. No, he said. I want you to stay. But stay careful. It was, neither of them realized at the time, the moment everything between them stopped being about the baby and started being about each other. The danger Damien feared arrived 2 weeks later, faster and uglier than he'd prepared for. A man named Victor Reyes, an old business rival who'd spent years circling Damien's empire looking for a crack to exploit, learned through a leak in his own organization about the Marsh connection living inside the Cross estate. Victor didn't care about old rivalries or honor among criminals, he cared about leverage, and a vulnerable infant inside a heavily guarded house represented exactly the kind of leverage that could force Damien into deals he'd never otherwise sign. It happened on a Tuesday evening, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. Elena had taken the baby out to the garden for fresh air, something Damien had started encouraging because his daughter seemed calmer outdoors, more like a child and less like a wound that wouldn't close. A van idled near the service entrance, 2 men inside watching the garden gate with the patient stillness of people who'd done this kind of work before. Elena noticed them before security did, a mother's instinct she didn't know she had until it mattered, sharpened by years of watching her own father's world for warning signs. She didn't scream. Screaming would have given them a reason to move faster. Instead, she scooped the baby up, walked calmly but quickly back toward the house, and triggered the silent alarm Damien had shown her weeks earlier, half as a joke, half as a precaution he hoped she'd never need. By the time the men realized their target was retreating, Marco's security team had already flooded the garden, and the van peeled away into traffic before anyone could stop it, but not before cameras captured enough to trace it back to Victor Reyes within the hour. Damien arrived home to find his daughter sleeping safely in her crib and Elena sitting on the nursery floor, still shaking, refusing to let anyone take the baby from arm's reach until she was certain the danger had truly passed. He knelt in front of her, something he'd never done for anyone in this house, not even staff he'd known for years, and took her trembling hands in his. "You saved her," he said, voice breaking in a way he hadn't allowed since his wife's funeral. "I just did what anyone would do," Elena whispered. "No," Damien said. "You did what someone who loves her would do." The words left his mouth before he'd fully decided to say them, and once spoken, they couldn't be unspoken. Elena looked up at him, eyes wet, and didn't deny it either. That night, after the house finally settled into uneasy quiet and extra security paced the grounds outside, Damien found Elena in the kitchen, unable to sleep, replacing the chaos in her chest with the mindless work of dishes nobody had asked her to wash. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood in the doorway and watched her, the same way she'd once watched him standing helpless with his crying daughter, except now the helplessness belonged to him in an entirely different way. "I almost lost her today," he said quietly. "And somewhere in the middle of being terrified, all I could think was that I almost lost you too." Elena set down the dish towel, her hands no longer steady. "Mr. Cross." "Damien," he corrected, stepping closer. "Just Damien. Please." "Damien," she repeated, like she'd been waiting weeks for permission to say it. "I'm a maid in your house. People like me don't get to." "I don't care what people like you are supposed to get," he interrupted, gently, the coldness she'd heard described by every member of the staff nowhere in his voice now. "I care about the fact that my daughter only stopped crying when you held her. I care about the fact that I haven't felt anything but numbness in 8 months, and somehow you walked into my house and made me feel something again, and it terrifies me, and I don't want to keep pretending it doesn't." He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back, to remind him of the lines that existed between a man like him and a woman like her. She didn't step back. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the kind of kiss that happens in a rush of desperation. It was slow, careful, like he was relearning how to want something gently after months of only knowing how to survive. Elena kissed him back like she'd been holding her breath since the day she first walked into that nursery, and finally let herself exhale. They didn't have illusions about how complicated this would become. The staff would talk. Victor Reyes would not simply disappear because one kidnapping attempt failed. Damien's world ran on power and perception, and a maid standing beside him as something more than staff would invite scrutiny from every direction, rivals looking for weakness, board members questioning his judgment, old enemies of the Calloway family wondering if old grudges might resurface through her. But 2 days later, when Damien stood in front of his entire household staff and introduced Elena not as the help, but as the woman who had saved his daughter's life and the woman he intended to build a future with, none of those complications mattered as much as the steadiness in his voice, or the way his daughter reached for Elena from his arms the moment she came near, gripping her sleeve with one small fist like she'd finally found the person she'd been crying for all along. Victor Reyes would resurface. The Calloway shadow would not vanish overnight. The empire Damien had built on cold calculation would have to learn to make room for something it had never accounted for, love, arriving uninvited, in the unlikeliest hands in the house. But for the first time since his wife's funeral, Damien Cross stood in his own home and felt something other than grief waiting for him there. And for the first time in years, Elena Marsh let herself believe that hope wasn't a luxury reserved for people born into easier lives. Sometimes, it simply waited in a nursery, in the middle of someone else's storm, for the right person to walk in and refuse to be afraid. If you made it this far, you already know this story earned that subscribe button. Hit it, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Epilogue. 3 months later, the Cross estate looked different in ways no contractor had been hired to create. Sunlight seemed to find more windows. The kitchen staff cooked larger meals because Damien had started eating dinner at the table instead of at his desk, and because his daughter, now crawling and babbling and reaching for everything within arm's length, had become impossible to keep contained to a high chair in the nursery alone. Elena no longer wore the grey uniform. Damien had insisted, gently but immovably, that the woman raising his daughter and standing beside him at dinners with men who controlled half the dogs in the city would not be introduced as anyone's maid ever again. She'd resisted at first, uncomfortable with rooms that didn't feel like they belonged to her yet, but slowly, the discomfort faded into something steadier. Victor Reyes did resurface, as Damien had warned he would, attempting one final, clumsy play for leverage that ended not in violence but in his own business partners abandoning him once word spread that he targeted a child to gain ground. Even in Damien's world, certain lines, once crossed, ended a man's usefulness to everyone around him. Frank Marsh, Elena's father, reached out once, tentatively, having heard through all channels that his daughter had found her way into the Cross family. Elena agreed to one cautious meeting, neither forgiving him fully nor closing the door completely, choosing instead the harder, more honest path of figuring out, slowly, what room remained in her life for a man who had once chosen the wrong things over her. Tommy's surgery went well. He visited the estate for the first time the week after his recovery, wide-eyed at the marble floors he'd heard his sister scrub for months, and Damien shook his hand like he was already family, because by then, in every way that mattered, he was. On a quiet evening in early spring, Damien found Elena in the garden where the kidnapping attempt had once threatened to take everything from them, his daughter asleep against Elena's shoulder, and he understood, watching them both in the fading light, that grief and love had never actually been opposites at all, that loving Elena hadn't erased what he'd lost, it had simply proven to him that his heart, despite everything, still knew how to open. "Stay," he said, the same word he'd said to her the night everything changed, except this time it meant something far larger than a job. "I'm not going anywhere," Elena answered, and meant it with everything she had left to give. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, smash that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and let me know below, what would you have done in Elena's place?